But I think the largest divergency, what has caused the biggest breach between myself and other journalists who have a similar view as I do, on the one hand, in corporate media and American liberalism on the other, was this insistence on depicting Donald Trump not as a candidate with a bad ideology, or not as somebody who was incompetent to run for president or unqualified to execute the office, but instead as this once in a lifetime or once in a generation unprecedented evil, the likes of which the United States has never seen before. And the reason I found this so repellent and so odious and so offensive to the truth is because this claim was coming from the very same people who were the authors of all these lies and morally reprehensible policies and disastrous wars that impelled me to enter journalism in the first place, and that I devoted the first 10 years of my journalism to documenting, namely all the crimes that took place under the banner of the war on terror, not just the invasion of Iraq and the destruction of that country that gave rise to ISIS, based on all sorts of falsehoods that the government and their media allies spread, but all of the prongs of the war on terror, from bombing 8 Muslim countries and constantly killing civilians, to the creation of due process-free prisons where people were put in cages for 15 or 20 years, some of whom are still kept there without even bothering to try them with any crime. The creation of radical theories that said that even U.S. citizens could be imprisoned without trial, without even contact with the outside world, if the president just decrees them to be an enemy combatant. All sorts of horrific and hideous lies and crimes that destroyed the Constitution, the importation of the Patriot Act, and warrantless mass spying on domestic populations. And it was shocking to me, genuinely, to watch the very same people who did those things, the worst crimes in American history, or at least in the last 7 or 8 decades, that the very same people responsible for them were welcomed back into the media, were empowered by the media, were celebrated by American liberals, also that they could turn around and act like they were so alarmed by Donald Trump's unprecedented attack on all things decent. And whatever you think of Donald Trump, there's simply no case to be made that anything that he did, whatever the worst things are in the same universe of destruction and moral crimes and legal crimes and the lies that were undertaken by the U.S. government and the U.S. security state under 2 separate presidents, all justified in the name of avenging the 9/11 attack and persecuting the war on terror. And as we've been doing over the last 2 weeks, ever since this new war erupted between Israel and Gaza, where so many of the similarities between the post 9/11 climate in the United States and the climate that is governing now when it comes to the war in Israel are so self-evident and apparent, we've been encouraging everybody to take a deep breath and try and be sober and not allow the same manipulation of your emotions that took place after 9/11 that bred so many of these disastrous policies to once again work, to use your faculties of reason and your critical thought process, and most importantly of all, to remember the lessons of 9/11, the fact that so many Americans were induced to support policies that they were told were vital to crush terrorists and to avenge the attack. The same thing we're being told now with respect to Israel, only for so many Americans to come to realize, in some cases very quickly, in some cases over time, that the policies they were induced to support were in fact completely counterproductive, that it didn't stop terrorism at all, but actually made the problem worse, that it wasn't designed to benefit the American people, but only a tiny sliver of people in power, especially neocons who had their own agenda that had nothing to do with protecting the citizens of the United States, and that in so many ways forever marred the perception of the United States in the world. That wasn't done by Donald Trump, but instead by George Bush, Dick Cheney, and his team of neocons, in many ways extended by President Obama. And so when telling you that we hope that you will apply the lessons of 9/11, we stopped and realized, well, what are those lessons exactly that we're hoping will be applied? And what is the history of 9/11 and the war on terror that we keep referring to as so crucial to preserve and then apply? And so we decided to go back, and one of the things we tried to do on Friday nights is to take a little bit of a step back from the immediacy of the news cycle and be able to delve deeply into the historical context necessary for understanding events. We've been doing that. We did that just recently with the 1990s and Waco and Ruby Ridge and the war on civil liberties on the part of the U.S. security services that took place in the 1990s that have given rise to the abuses of today. We've done that in other instances as well, or have done interviews that are designed to take a little bit of a step back from the news cycle because people have more time on Friday night and over the weekend to consume those kind of programs than if we just throw it into the middle of the week. And we found that the feedback is great. Often they're the most watched shows. And so we thought it was a perfect moment to go back and remind you of some of the low points of the war on terror and the similarities that seem obvious to me with the current climate that has been deliberately cultivated as well in the name of launching new wars designed to crush the terrorists. So one of the things, as I said, that disturbed me more than anything else as I watched and lived through the response to the 9/11 attack. I lived in New York. I was there on 9/11. I shared all that rage and outrage and was also manipulated like so many other people and uniting behind George Bush and Dick Cheney like most of the country did. They had 90% approval rating. And the war in Afghanistan commanded virtually unanimous support, as did the enactment of the Patriot Act. What really was, I think, most notable, and that's worth remembering, is the repressive climate that emerged, the utter intolerance for dissent, the inability to dissent without having your reputation completely destroyed. And this emanated very deliberately from George Bush himself on September 20th, 2001, 10 days after the 9/11 attack, with the building still in rubble and the body count still unknown. He went before a joint session of Congress, his first address as president to the Congress since 9/11, in a speech written by the neocon warmonger David Frum, who has spent his career accusing everybody who opposes U.S. government wars as being a traitor or being unpatriotic. And Bush created this framework, this binary framework, where either you support everything the government does or you will be deemed to be on the side of terrorists. Here's a reminder of what he said.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
I mean, there you saw some intense applause, a standing ovation, prolonged applause, and that became the framework that I would suggest is just as present today. Either you support the war on terror, either you support everything Israel does, or you stand accused of being pro-terrorist, pro-Al-Qaeda, pro-Hamas. And it wasn't just George Bush who said it, although obviously him saying that 10 days after the attack with the country united behind him was the most important proclamation. It set the tone for everything that followed. But all sorts of journalists and commentators and people in the media did everything possible to fortify that framework by constantly accusing anybody off key of being a terrorist or a traitor. The writer Andrew Sullivan, who since has apologized for this and come to regret it, but at the time he was a vehement supporter for the war on terror in the way that British pundits like to get. There's something about British culture where they all want to be Winston Churchill. The minute it's time for a new war, they don't go to war, but they like to prance around and beat their chest and insist that somehow they're powerful and courageous and purposeful because they want to send other people to war. Coined a phrase, Andrew Sullivan did, a fifth column in the United States, meaning the term for traitors, for people who work within their own country to undermine and subvert their country by working with the enemy, that anybody who questioned George Bush or Dick Cheney, the war on terror, got immediately labeled that way. Imagine how damaging that is to one's reputation, just like it's quite damaging now to be called pro-Hamas for questioning what the Israelis are doing or the U.S. government support for it. Here is the media criticism group FAIR, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, which compiled in November 2001 the examples of how this was accomplished, of how any dissent was equated with treason. The headline is "Covering the Fifth Column. Media presents pro-war distortions of peace movement's views." And this is what it said. In place of consistent coverage of the peace movement, some pundits and columnists sounded the alarm about the threat to America from within. New Republic editor Peter Beinart on September 24, 2001, thought critics of the administration's plan should either keep quiet or explain their loyalties. Quote, "Domestic political dissent is immoral without a prior statement of national solidarity, a choosing of sides." In other words, if you don't stand up and say, I support the United States and love the United States and I'm on the side of America before expressing any kind of dissent, it means that you automatically are to be deemed treasonous, just like anybody who criticizes the United States support for Israel or the Israeli attack without first standing up and saying, Hamas, I condemn them vehemently as monsters and savages, is deemed to be the same. We have condemned the Hamas attack from the beginning, but it's this idea that unless you're constantly focused on that, no dissent is permitted without being accused of being on the side of Hamas. New Republic columnist and former editor Andrew Sullivan had a more ominous warning in the London Sunday Times on September 16, 2001. Quote, "The middle part of the country, the great red zone that voted for Bush, is clearly ready for war. The decadent left and its enclaves on the coast is not dead and may well mount a fifth column." The Washington Times columnist Robert Stacey McCain on September 27th was even more threatening, implying that military force should be used against anti-war protesters. Quote, "Why are we sending aircraft carriers halfway around the world to look for enemies when our nation's worst enemies, communists proclaiming an anti-American jihad, will be right there in front of the Washington Monument on Saturday?" He was referring to a protest against the war on terror and against going to war, which has typically been considered a fundamental American right, but wasn't at the time and isn't now. Right-wing provocateur David Horowitz in the LA Times on September 28th chided today's student activists with this reminder, quote, "The blood of hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese and tens of thousands of Americans is on the hands of the anti-war activists who prolonged the struggle and gave victory to the communists." Horowitz added that, quote, "This country was too tolerant toward the treason of its enemies within." That was very much the climate. And the amazing thing about it was that the number of people dissenting was extremely small. Almost nobody with any power. And yet it wasn't enough for them that there was short of 100% unity. It had to be 100% unity. They couldn't stand the fact that there was a stray voice over here and one over here asking questions in the context of 99-1 votes in Congress, or 434-1 votes in Congress, or 90% approval ratings. Just like they can't stand the fact that right now, every major American politician, with maybe one or two exceptions, is voicing vehement support in both political parties for U.S. support for Israel in this war. There's a college student group over here, and an assistant professor over here, and a speaker at a DA rally over there, offering very fringe and marginalized views, and they just are obsessed with it. There can't be any dissent, just like was true here. In fact, just to give you a sense for how unified the country was in the name of whatever George Bush wanted to do in the name of stopping terror, and how little dissent there was, and how much it transformed American political life for the worse, look at what happened with the Patriot Act. Here from the Electronic Privacy Information Center, its page on the Patriot Act has a little history. They say this. By the way, the Patriot Act, for those of you who don't remember, the official name was the Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism Act of 2001. That was the acronym that led them to call it the U.S. Patriot Act of 2001. The act was introduced less than a week after the September 11th attacks and passed with little debate or opposition. The Patriot Act expanded surveillance for law enforcement by, this is what the Patriot Act did, and again, almost no debate, passed very quickly, after 9/11 because no dissent was tolerated. It expanded domestic and international wiretapping and pen register monitoring. It expanded authority to access to electronic communications. It allowed secret, quote, sneak and peek searches. It removed privacy protections to allow federal agencies to share more information. And it expanded funding to federal law enforcement agencies. The Patriot Act was passed in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, although many provisions of the act had been proposed before to substantial criticism. Congress swiftly approved the act with little debate and no House, Senate, or conference report. Everybody was petrified to oppose something called the Patriot Act in the wake of 9/11, because to do so would get you accused of being on the side of Al-Qaeda and not a patriot. Here's the roll call vote for the U.S. Senate passing the Patriot Act in October. There you see 98 of 100 senators voted yes, 1 didn't vote, and 1 voted no. The only no vote, the one single no vote in the Patriot Act in the Senate was from the civil libertarian Democrat Russ Feingold of Wisconsin. Every single other senator, Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton, John Kerry, all of them, along with every Republican, voted yes. Every single last one of them. And as the history said, it contained a lot of provisions that others had long proposed but could never get anywhere near passing because it was considered such a radical departure from the American tradition. It allowed massive amounts of domestic spying and the elimination of protections of all kinds, which is why even then it was considered radical and people were worried about it, but still not a single senator other than Russ Feingold was willing to vote no. In the House, which is usually a little bit more balanced because people who represent single districts, if they're very conservative, very liberal, have more leeway. The vote was still extremely lopsided. It was, here you see it, 357 votes in favor and only 66 opposed. 3 of those nay votes were Republicans, including Senator Ron Paul, unsurprisingly. But the overwhelming majority of the House in both political parties voted yes on the Patriot Act as well. That's what happens when a climate gets created where any dissent is deemed to be synonymous with treason. Now, in addition to the Patriot Act, there was also implemented, although unbeknownst to Americans until 2005 when the New York Times discovered it, a program that ordered mass warrantless spying on the calls of American citizens speaking to Americans overseas. There was a law in place, the FISA Act, that required warrants in order for the U.S. government to spy or surveil the telephone calls of American citizens, no matter with whom they were speaking. And the Bush administration secretly ordered that warrant requirement, which is based in law, to just be ignored when it came to Americans speaking with foreigners, people on foreign soil. They just said, we don't need a warrant anymore. We're not going to seek a warrant. We're just going to listen in. They did it in secret. And we didn't know about it until 2005. The New York Times actually discovered the existence of this program in 2004, 6 months before George Bush's reelection. And when the New York Times advised the White House that it had discovered this program, the White House called the editor and the publisher of the New York Times into the Oval Office, George Bush did, and said, if you reveal this program, you're going to have blood on your hands. You're going to cause terrorist attacks to take place. And if you want this blood on your hands, then go ahead and publish it. But if you don't. Now, that argument never made sense. How could it help terrorists to know that the U.S. was spying on calls without warrants instead of with warrants? It was only of interest to American citizens into the Constitution and the law. But the New York Times got scared and didn't publish it. They allowed George Bush to be reelected without telling Americans this was being done. And the only reason the New York Times finally reported it was because one of the reporters, Jim Risen, got so angry that he couldn't report his story that he wrote a book in which he was going to report it. And the New York Times got scared. They didn't want to be scooped by their own reporter in a book. And so they finally published it. And they won a Pulitzer for this story. And they celebrated their bravery, the New York Times did, even though they were cowed out of publishing it for almost 18 months. But here's what was done in that climate where no dissent was permitted, where everything done in the name of terrorism was justified. There you see the headline, Bush lets the U.S. spy on callers without warrants. Quote, months after the September 11th attacks, President Bush secretly authorized the National Security Agency, the NSA, to eavesdrop on Americans and others inside the United States to search for evidence of terrorist activity without the court-approved warrants ordinarily required for domestic spying, according to government officials. Under a presidential order signed in 2002, the intelligence agency has monitored the international telephone calls and international email messages of hundreds, perhaps thousands of people inside the United States without warrants over the past 3 years. In an effort to track possible, quote, dirty numbers linked to al-Qaeda, the official said. Of course, it's always justified in the name of keeping you safe. That's the point. So much of what's justified in the name of fighting terror is actually about nothing having to do with that. The Patriot Act, for example, that we just covered, ended up being applied far more often in cases having nothing to do with terrorism than it did with terrorism cases, even though the justification for why they needed these radical powers was to stop terrorism. The New York Times went on, quote, the agency, they said, still seeks warrants to monitor entirely domestic communications. The previously undisclosed decision to permit some eavesdropping inside the country without court approval was a major shift in American intelligence gathering practices, particularly for the NSA, whose mission is to spy on communications abroad. As a result, some officials familiar with the continuing operation have questioned whether the surveillance has stretched, if not crossed, constitutional limits on legal searches. Quote, this is really a sea change, said a former senior official who specializes in national security law. It's almost a mainstay of this country that the NSA only does foreign searches. At least it used to be a mainstay of the United States until 9/11 happened, just like the Patriot Act was unthinkable until then too. So just on those bases alone, those two events, the Patriot Act and warrantless spying, and obviously with the Snowden story, we demonstrated that warrantless spying had also now taken place on domestic communications, collecting the list of everybody who Americans were calling and how long they were speaking. Just on the basis of these things alone, it should be evident how dangerous it is when you let people insist that anyone dissenting from the U.S. government's policies and from its wars are pro-terrorist, pro-Al-Qaeda, pro-Hamas. Because when that climate is allowed to take root and nobody can dissent for fear of being accused of that, all sorts of things happen that are justified or sold in the name of fighting terrorism that in fact are about everything but that. That is a crucial lesson to have learned. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.